The American West, majestic, immense, spectacular, an almost legendary land still bearing the handiwork of creation. Onto this stage of natural grandeur in the early 19th century strode a small band of extraordinary men almost as unique and colorful as the western wilderness that became their new home. They were known as the Mountain Men, and they would become an American legend, larger than life. They were adventurous, tough, determined, innovative, and, at least those who survived, were gifted with a unique set of skills that would prove essential to living and lasting in the western wilds. Their era would be fleeting, but when it was done, they would have forever altered the youthful American nation. They came west in search of furs, but not just any fur. They were willing to travel thousands of miles, expose themselves to blistering heat, numbing cold, man-deep snowfall, hunger, isolation, loneliness, illness, frostbite, and death by accident, animal, or Indian, all in search of the thick, glossy pelt of the North American beaver. And what launched these rugged frontiersmen on their dangerous wilderness quest for beaver? The answer, a passing whim of fashion, the beaver hat. In faraway Paris and in London, New York, and other major cities in the early 1800s, in the elite salons where trends of fashion were established, the beaver hat emerged as the crown of the well-tailored gentleman's attire, sweeping away almost all demand for the once popular cloth hat.
And the fad back then was to be dressed up in a fancy coat and have just a perfect shiny beaver top hat on. And because the beaver had a waterproof hide, it made it nice for the eastern cities that had drizzle and rain and so forth. That top hat would shed the rain. It wouldn't soak and sag all over their heads.
This is an actual beaver hat, just a very short fur, so they would not use all of the fur of the beaver, but the shorter hairs that were underneath.
In European and American hat manufacturing centers, such as Danbury, Connecticut, the hat-making workers, known in the day as hatters, would refine and compress the beaver fur into animal felt and use it to render millions of hats. Ironically, the industry not only put countless beavers at risk, but also posed a deadly danger to the hatters.
They used some sort of compounds using mercury, and that's where the term crazy as a Mad Hatter came from, because the hatters would be using these mercury compounds, and the buggers ended up poisoning themselves inadvertently.
It was to the American West that the fur industry turned to meet the incessant demand for beaver pelts in the opening decades of the 1800s. By then, demand for fur for everything from muffs to cloaks to collars to coats had already depleted much of the fur resources of the East. At the time, the Rocky Mountains and their boulder-strewn slopes, creeks and streams, sprawling forest of quaking aspen and towering snow-covered heights were largely unknown east of the Mississippi River. Referred to by Native Americans and early French-Canadian voyageurs as the Stony Mountains or the Shining Mountains, the Rockies, like much of the West, were viewed by Easterners as mysterious, forbidding, impassable. But that changed due to the demand for beaver fur. In 1803, under President Thomas Jefferson, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the nation's size with 827,000 square miles of largely uncharted wilderness that lay west of the Mississippi River. It was penetrated by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 and probed later by other military explorations, but in the early 19th century, the Louisiana Territory and its lakes, rivers, prairies, forests, valleys, and towering peaks were largely unknown to anyone west of the Mississippi. At its heart were the Rocky Mountains, a range of mountains that stretched for more than 1,200 miles from the border of Canada all the way to what is now northern New Mexico, and which in some places was 300 miles wide. It was inhabited by numerous Native American people who had drifted into the Rockies in ages past, including major Indian nations such as the Ute, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, the Crow, the Nez Perce, and the Blackfeet. Some tribes welcomed the trade that the fur industry brought to the West, at least initially, but others did not, especially as the western flow of European Americans increased in numbers and encroached on Indian lands. The Rockies were also inhabited by a variety of wild game, buffalo herds that numbered in the thousands, wolves that howled in the night, giant herds of elk and mule deer, bighorn sheep and mountain goats, black, brown, and grizzly bears, towering antlered moose, mountain lions that prowled the forested highlands, soaring eagles and hawks, abundant waterfowl, and vast varieties of small game, including uncountable numbers of beaver.
As I understand it, they were getting anywhere between $4 and $6 a pelt. You could make a heck of a lot more in 3 or 4 months trapping than you could make back in the big city working.
Even at the peak of the beaver hat rage, no more than several hundred trappers were at work in the Rockies at any one time. And those few, the mountain men, were a remarkable, unique breed of Americans. In the early 19th century, the principal jumping-off point into the West was the rough-and-tumble city of St. Louis, and from there in 1807, a hard-charging Hispanic-American merchant named Manuel Lisa led a large party of trappers into what is now southern Montana, where they built a wilderness trading post.
Back in the early 1800s, beaver fur was where the money was. It was amazing how expensive those beaver hats were, and the pelts generated a tremendous income for the trappers.
Determined to make his fortune in fur money, Lisa and several partners established the Missouri Fur Company, and when his Montana post failed, he built others in the wilderness. Over the course of 13 years, he repeatedly took keelboats up the Missouri River into the western wilderness in search of beaver fur. And while he established long-term peaceful relations with several Indian tribes, his quest for Rocky Mountain riches was blocked by the powerful Blackfeet, who repulsed his forays into their territory, killed his trappers, and wrecked his plans. Worn out and ill in his 50s, Lisa died at his home in St. Louis, his dream of a fur fortune unfulfilled. But others shared Lisa's dream, and one who did strike it rich in the fur trade was a German butcher's son who came to America peddling a crate of flutes. His name was John Jacob Astor, and he possessed a rare talent for business. Based in New York City, where he got rich from bonds and businesses, Astor saw the potential of the fur trade and established the American Fur Company in 1808. To make it work, he left the safety of the East to go west, establishing Fur Company headquarters in the Oregon country of the Pacific Northwest. His major competitors included the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, the Northwest Company, and the Hudson's Bay Company. A fierce competitor, Astor eventually controlled 75% of all American fur exports. Then he sold out and moved on to making new fortunes after proving that riches could be harvested from the western beaver trade.
Competition could get pretty severe, if not even deadly on occasion. Whoever could hunt and trap the beaver could make a lot of income, so money was definitely involved, plus maybe a little bit of reputation.
In 1822, a St. Louis newspaper advertisement called for 100 enterprising young men to head up the Missouri River in keelboats to trap beaver in the western wilds. It was placed by a middle-aged St. Louis gunpowder manufacturer named William Ashley, who was also lieutenant governor of Missouri. Ashley established the Rocky Mountain Fur Company in partnership with a St. Louis bullet manufacturer named Andrew Henry, and dispatched his 100 enterprising young men up the Missouri River to trap beaver in the wilderness of what is now South Dakota. Immediately, they encountered disaster. In what would become the deadliest ambush in the history of the fur trade, 15 company trappers were killed by Arikara Indians. Who can feel safe in the midst of Indian country, admitted a novice trapper, where the foe lurks in silence and secrecy and seems to come and go on the wings of the wind. In response to the Arikara ambush, Ashley abandoned keelboat travel in the Missouri River region and instead sent his trappers into the Rocky Mountains by horseback in small parties or brigades that were harder for the Indians to detect. In so doing, he shifted the main focus of the American fur trade to the Rocky Mountains and proved that trappers could survive and succeed there in small parties or even alone. Whether a company man or what became known as a free trapper, the mountain man became a unique brand of American entrepreneur, willing to risk everything to live and work in the wilderness of the Rocky Mountain West.
They definitely had to be courageous, adventuresome, a little bit creative, trying to deal with all kinds of terrain, weather, and other cultures.
Ashley also popularized what would become known as the rendezvous system, sending agents into the Rockies to resupply trappers and pick up their bundled beaver pelts so they would not have to waste time traveling back to St. Louis. Eventually, Ashley gave up fur trapping for life in Washington, D.C., where he served Missouri as a 3-term congressman. But his innovations revolutionized the Rocky Mountain fur trade. And as they trapped their way through the Rockies and wandered in the western wilds, Ashley's 100 enterprising young men and other mountain men gathered critically important information on Western geography, increased American knowledge of the West, and encouraged westward expansion. Few American explorers covered more territory and exposed more geography than mountain man Jedediah Smith. A towering native New Yorker, Smith left his job as a youthful deckhand on a Lake Erie cargo boat to seek his fortune in the West. where he became one of William Ashley's enterprising young men. While wandering the West, Smith identified a pass through the Rockies that would prove to be vital in opening the Oregon Trail, over which wagon trains bearing some 400,000 Americans would later cross the continent to Oregon, California, and other parts of the far West in one of the greatest mass migrations in history. Within the ranks of the mountain men, Smith was also unique because he was literate, well-educated, and devout.
Quite a few of the mountain men talked about here was a man who brought his faith, his religion, into the Rockies where most men of that lifestyle did not. He was kind of an oddity to the mountain men. He did not get drunk. He would not use profanity. He was often referring to God or praying. Men trusted him. He was a respected leader, but he was not brash and loud and a braggart.
For more than a decade, Jedediah Smith survived an astonishing number of life-threatening experiences, including the 3 deadliest Indian ambushes of the fur trade era. In 1831, however, at age 32, he was killed by a Comanche war party while traveling the Santa Fe Trail. He left behind a legacy of personal faith and a record as one of America's greatest explorers. It was more than money that lured many mountain men to the trapper's life in the snow-covered peaks of the West. For many, the foremost attraction was the West itself, especially the Rocky Mountains. "My desire was to see the Rocky Mountains," a former trapper recalled, "and all the hardships to be endured could not prevent me from doing so." Another Western wanderer who never forgot his first impression of the Rocky Mountain high country managed to put it into writing. "Before me lay a beautiful valley, covered by green grass and surrounded by towering mountains covered with snow and spotted by groves of tall spruce trees, while wild game carelessly feeding in the green valleys contributed to the wild and romantic splendor of the surrounding country." The mountain man's life was not an easy one. Even among the natural splendor of the American West, the mountain man's life in reality was often dangerous, demanding, and dirty. Aside from the obvious deadly threats to life and limb, trapping beaver meant working in cold weather and deep snow, and in the bone-chilling waters of mountain streams, lakes, and beaver ponds. And acquiring a bundle of beaver pelts over the course of a year required special wilderness skills, such as knowledge of the outdoors, horse handling, weaponry, hunting, the ways of beaver, and the use of steel traps.
They would set the trap spring-loaded with a heavy-duty spring in the target beaver's territory, and his foot would get stuck in the trap, and it would pull him underwater and drown him.
To make it all work, trappers would typically set up trap lines in the summer and then move up into the higher elevations of the mountains in the wintertime so they could trap beaver when their fur was thickest.
The beaver pelts had a much more luxuriant underfur in the wintertime, and that was when the pelts were richest.
Mountain men would camp outdoors in the fall, spring, and summer, but in the wintertime most would build structures that they could heat with some kind of fireplace, dugouts carved into the side of a mountain, or sturdy log cabins deep in the forest, some of which still stand in ruins in remote spots throughout the Rockies. In any structure, however, a winter season in the snow-covered Rocky Mountains could be dangerous if the trapper was snowbound and ran out of food. Some snowbound mountain men, it was said, in desperation, ate their moccasins.
It was not an easy not an easy life, one that you definitely had to love or you wouldn't put up with it very long.
Working deep in the Rocky Mountains throughout the winter, the mountain men eagerly anticipated the annual rendezvous, especially for a reunion with their fellow trappers. The rendezvous is one continued scene of drinking, gambling, and brawling, reported an eyewitness, as long as the trappers' money and credit last. Recalled another observer, there is unceasing whooping and howling. Friendly Indians are constantly dashing through the camp on horseback, yelling like fiends. You can hear the barking and baying of wolf dogs, the incessant cracking of rifles, and the loud jargon of traders with goods to sell. It is perfect bedlam.
Shooting, tomahawk throwing, knife throwing, wrestling, horse riding, all kinds of things. So it was kind of a let loose time.
One Easterner who attended a Rocky Mountain rendezvous was alarmed to witness a deadly shootout between two mountain men, and was later shocked to see the dead man's colleagues using his body for a card table. When the rendezvous ended and the traders headed back east with their furs and profits, many mountain men went back to their traps with empty pockets. But, as some said, it was a life of freedom. One mountain man who unquestionably savored the freedom of the wilderness West more than most was James Beckwourth, who was one of a significant number of African Americans to serve in the ranks of mountain men. Beckwourth was born a slave in Virginia, but was freed at age 21 and soon headed to the West, first as a miner and later as a mountain man. Beckwourth's exploits led him on treks through some of the most remote regions of the Rockies, into California's Sierra Nevada range and throughout much of the West. Like many other mountain men, he took an Indian wife. He moved in with the Crow Nation, engaged in fighting against their enemies, and claimed to have become a high-ranking chief. Eventually, he left the Crow tribe and the fur trade to serve as an army guide in the Western Indian Wars. And in the 1850s, he told his story to an Eastern writer who published a colorful autobiography entitled The Life and Adventures of James P. Beckwourth, Mountaineer, Scout, Pioneer, and Chief of the Crow Nation. The ranks of the mountain men were far more ethnically diverse than other early 19th century professions. French-Canadian trappers composed a large segment of the trade. So did Hispanic Americans, especially in the southern Rockies. Also found within the ranks of the mountain men in large numbers were Native American trappers, especially from the Delaware, Shawnee, and Iroquois tribes. Pushed westward from their ancestral lands in the east by European American expansion and by other Indian tribes, the Delaware in particular were expert trappers and generally worked alongside the other mountain men as equals. Whether white, black, French-Canadian, Hispanic, or Indian, all mountain men had something in common: the opportunity to make money in the mountains and the danger of being killed while doing so. A time-honored proverb within the Crow Indian Nation stated, "The earth you see is not just earth. It contains the blood, flesh, and bones of our ancestors. It is consecrated." The Native American peoples of the West revered their lands, and some tribes would fight ferociously against anyone they deemed to be an intruder. Most feared by the mountain men were the Blackfeet, so named for the color of their moccasins, who occupied a sprawling region of what is now western Montana. The Blackfeet were powerful and warlike in defense of their territory, and they generally viewed those who entered their lands without invitation, whether other Indians or mountain men, to be enemies.
The Indians were good fighters, but the mountain man learned to be, if he survived, pretty scrappy himself.
Mountain man John Colter learned firsthand what it meant to be deemed an enemy by the Blackfeet when he and a companion attempted to pass through Blackfeet territory. A young Southerner, Colter had traveled with the Lewis and Clark expedition as an able and respected hunter and had been allowed to leave the expedition early to return to the western wilds to trap and explore. His travels through the uncharted West added much knowledge about Western geography, and he is believed by many to be the first to report on the wonders of what is now Yellowstone National Park, which in his lifetime was dubbed Colter's Hell because of his reports of its geysers and other geothermal features. In 1809, deep in the Rocky Mountains, Colter and another trapper were captured by Blackfeet warriors. The Indians killed the other trapper but decided to give Colter a chance to run for his life. He was stripped naked and given a head start, with some of the tribe's toughest warriors following hard on his heels.
They apparently wanted to give him a sporting chance and to train their braves at the same time. So he was told to run, and he took off with the braves after him.
Colter was a fast runner, and he quickly outdistanced most of the Blackfeet, except for one powerful warrior. Colter kept running, then quickly turned, tripped his opponent, and finished him off with his own spear. Then Colter resumed his race. By the time the other Blackfeet caught up, he was hidden beneath a beaver lodge or dam. His pursuers gave up, and Colter hiked more than 200 miles naked and shoeless back to safety.
I think he was walking for 11 days or so. Quite an amazing story, Colter's run.
Despite the deadly threat at times from some Indian tribes, many mountain men sympathized with the Native American people, married Indians, lived with them, or attempted to intercede on their behalf as interpreters or Indian agents.
The trappers were a limited number of people. They lived under similar conditions, usually nature-friendly for the most part, and it didn't impact the Native Americans as much as the later miners and farmers and ranchers that came out.
Among the Western Indians who traded with or even befriended the mountain men was the Crow Nation, whose members were described by many mountain men as among the most physically attractive people in the West. They had been driven westward by other Indian tribes, were bitter enemies with the Sioux or Lakota Nation, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, and often provided scouts for army operations against tribes that were mutual enemies. Many trappers married Crow women, and the mountain men generally got along well with the tribe. One who reportedly did not was a trapper named John Johnston, whose real name was John Garrison, and who reportedly ran away from the sailor's life in the Navy and eventually became a mountain man. According to Western lore, while Johnston was trapping in the Rockies, his Indian wife, for some reason, was killed by a Crow raiding party. And in retaliation, Johnston declared a one-man war on the Crow Nation. As his war continued, Johnston had to worry about Crow warriors attacking him from behind every boulder and tree as he trapped in what is now Wyoming and Montana. But he was equally relentless and did battle with countless Crow warriors one at a time.
The Crow were an interesting group because they would tend to fight man to man, not send a group over and just get rid of the guy.
Eventually, after a long period of unceasing combat, John Johnston and the Crow Nation declared a truce. In later life, Johnston performed in a Wild West show, and some historians believe that his one-man war with the Crow Nation was largely a legend that arose from his act in the show. Others, however, believe the legend is based on reality.
He dealt with at least 20 man-to-man fights with Crow warriors and was victorious in all 20.
Was his one-man war fact or fiction? Mountain Man John Johnston apparently never said, and when he died in a California veterans' home in 1900, he took the truth with him. Many mountain men seem to view the possibility of being killed and scalped by Indians as simply an occupational hazard. And, according to Western lore, one of their favorite salutations to each other was a warning to protect life and scalp. "Watch your top knot," one would say. "Watch yourn," another would reply. We heard a sullen growl about 10 feet from us, which was instantly followed by a lurch of the bear toward us. His enormous jaws were extended and his eyes were flashing fire. We could not retain sufficient presence of mind to shoot at him, but took to our heels. He is a dangerous varmint. So recalled a mountain man after his first encounter with the Rocky Mountains' chief predator, the grizzly bear. Weighing up to 1,000 pounds, equipped with piercing sharp teeth, powerful jaws, and 4-inch claws, the grizzly bear was respected and feared by Indians and mountain men alike.
So you can imagine dealing with a beast out of the wild who considered you an enemy, an invader of this size with this kind of a claw.
The mountain man would avoid a grizzly bear if possible, fight him if necessary. I've heard the stories of a mountain man fighting a bear virtually to the death. One or the other of them was going to die, and they both knew that.
Mountain men were understandably well armed as they worked in the Rockies, carrying rifles, tomahawks, knives, and sometimes handguns. The long arm of choice was likely the percussion-firing Hawken rifle, produced by gunmakers Jacob and Samuel Hawken in St. Louis. It was available with bore sizes up to 60 caliber.
This was kind of a little bit of the law, the justifier, the equalizer out west against man or beast.
As he moved through the thickets on one of his western treks, mountain man Jedediah Smith walked up on a grizzly bear, which mauled him terribly, tearing off his scalp and one ear before the bear retreated. The mangled mountain man afterward lay unmoving in the thickets, calmly reciting the 23rd Psalm while waiting on help. When his fellow mountain men declared it impossible to repair his damaged head, Smith held up a mirror and directed a companion how to sew back on his scalp and ear. While hunting for game in a stand of riverside willow bushes in the early 1820s, mountain man Hugh Glass surprised a sow grizzly with cubs and was horribly mauled before the other trappers killed the bear. Fearful of being wiped out by Rickeraw Indians, his trapping party hastily headed home, leaving 2 young novice trappers to bury Glass when he died, and death seemed imminent. Left alone in the wilderness and convinced Glass would soon succumb to his injuries, the novices panicked and abandoned him, taking his rifle and supplies with them. But Glass did not die. He awakened in the wilds, realized he had been abandoned, and set about to fend for himself.
He looked so badly torn up, but he went to looking for berries, probably eating bark, finding carcasses of animals, even at one point fighting wolves off to get what was left of I think a buffalo carcass or something.
Driven by revenge and determined to punish the young trappers who had left him alone and unarmed in the wilderness, he crawled, hobbled, and hiked more than 200 miles back to his post. But when he finally reached home, he decided to spare the 2 young men who had left him to die alone.
He eventually let both of those men live and let them go and moved on.
Besides the dangers of grizzly bears and Indians, mountain men faced injury or death from an astonishing variety of threats. Mountain lions killed some. So did rattlesnakes. Some drowned in western rivers. A young man named Patterson attempted to cross the river in a heavy current in spite of the advice of all present, recalled a mountain man. He sank to rise no more. His wild and rash temper got the better of his reason. Some fell off mountain cliffs. Others accidentally shot themselves or were killed in arguments with other trappers. A few died of hydrophobia after being bitten by rabid wolves. Some were struck down by smallpox, tetanus, typhoid fever, or pneumonia. Others were injured or permanently blinded by solar retinophony, snow blindness. Famed 19th century American historian Francis Parkman wrote, "I defy the annals of chivalry to furnish the record of a life more wild and perilous than that of a Rocky Mountain trapper."
He was a very independent, hard-nosed type person. Well, I'm going to freeze a couple of fingers off, but that's the way it goes. I can make do with less fingers.
After a career in the fur trade, some mountain men became prominent leaders in other professions, building and operating trading posts in the far-flung regions of the West, serving as Army scouts, guiding explorers and wagon trains of pioneers, becoming successful merchants or ranchers, working as interpreters or government Indian agents, or rising to prominence as political leaders. Kentucky-born Kit Carson, one of the most famous of all mountain men, was described by a contemporary as a man who, quote, wasn't afraid of hell or high water and who never cussed more than what was necessary.
He was an adventurous type guy. He probably personified more of the true mountain man than many of the others.
After a remarkable career as a trapper, Carson distinguished himself as a guide for John C. Fremont, the most famous American explorer of his day, was engaged in a controversial campaign against the Navajo tribe in the Southwest, served as an Indian agent, and eventually became a brigadier general in the United States Army, even though he never learned to read or write. Kit Carson's mentor, mountain man Tom Fitzpatrick, survived a running battle with Indians so grueling that it turned his hair white. Even so, he later journeyed to Washington to intercede for Native American rights. For more than a decade, mountain man Joseph Meek trapped beaver throughout the Rockies, married the daughter of a Nez Perce chief, survived Indian ambushes, a grizzly attack, and other perils to become a guide on the Oregon Trail, then a U.S. Marshal, and later a legislator in Oregon Territory. No one in the fur trade, except possibly Jedediah Smith, traveled the West and discovered as much as mountain man Joseph Walker. A Tennessee native, Walker trapped, traveled, and explored throughout the western wilderness, becoming among the first to report the spectacular country that would become Yosemite National Park, and was instrumental in opening trails to the gold fields in California and northern Arizona. Mountain man Robert Campbell, an Irish immigrant who came west to improve his health, built fortified trading posts in the western wilds, including Fort Laramie, which eventually became the most important army post on the Oregon Trail. Campbell survived the fur trade to become a St. Louis bank president and an important Indian commissioner who tried hard to end the Western Indian Wars. Bent's Fort, a fortified trading post in southeastern Colorado, was built by former mountain man Charles Bent, and it became the largest and most important trading post on the American end of the Santa Fe Trail. Perhaps the most famous mountain man of all was Jim Bridger, a St. Louis orphan who headed to the Rockies as a beaver trapper while still a teenager, and ironically was one of the young trappers who abandoned mountain man Hugh Glass in the wilderness after his grizzly mauling. Bridger spent more than 20 years trapping in the Rockies from the Canadian border to northern New Mexico, survived Indian ambushes and numerous other close calls, and outlived 3 Indian wives.
I believe his first wife died out of rabies, so that would be a tough one.
After his long career as a beaver trapper, Bridger established an important trading post in southwestern Wyoming, which was named Fort Bridger, and led important military expeditions and explorations, earning the nickname the Atlas of the West. Bridger never grew tired of extolling the natural wonders of the West he so loved, but he did grow weary of being doubted by Eastern listeners.
They thought he was just crazy as a Mad Hatter. He described the geysers and fumaroles and steam coming out all over the place, and that was unheard of in the eastern part of the United States.
Once, in exasperation with a group of Eastern doubters, Bridger reportedly decided to dupe them with the tale that he had once been in a petrified forest, where he saw petrified trees with petrified limbs on which there were petrified birds that were singing petrified songs. Eventually, the era of the mountain men ended, struck down by a new fad of fashion, the tall silk hat, which in the 1840s became the new rage for well-attired gentlemen in Europe and America.
People wanted silk hats instead, and so the cost and the payment, the finances for the beaver industry dropped.
What proved to be the last rendezvous was held in 1840 on the Green River in what is now Wyoming. By then, ironically, much of what the mountain men admired the most about the American West was also in decline, due in no small measure to the success of their beaver trapping efforts. Trapped incessantly, the beaver population was greatly diminished in the Rockies. And at the beginning of a decline, too, were the Native American nations that the mountain men respected and often married into, which, by 1840, were dramatically diminishing as the West attracted increasing numbers of Eastern settlers.
So the mountain man was kind of the forerunner. He was not out to change the whole way the America worked, but that's what he ended up doing.
The impact of the mountain men in American history was momentous. Their wandering through the western wilds, often as the first people to widely report what they encountered, added immensely to the geographical and scientific knowledge of the once mysterious West, excited the imaginations of Americans eager for new life and new land, and proved critical to the eventual settlement of the western frontier.
They're remembered in the geography and the geographic terms that we have. They're remembered for their frontier's attitude, and it's an attitude of live and let live off the land, take from nature what nature can provide for you.
Stand today amid the natural wonders of the American West, and it is difficult not to marvel at the life, the legend, and the legacy of the mountain men. Their story, like the western landscape, is extraordinary, remarkable, grand in scope, unforgettable, and uniquely American.